Thank you for joining us on Business History with HRI, a historical research international link webcast. Our inaugural guest today is Professor Joe Martin. He's the founding president of the Canadian Business History Association and at the University of Toronto Rotman School of Management Finance. He serves as the director of the Canadian Business and Financial History Program. Professor Martin is a graduate of the United College, now the University of Winnipeg, where he attained a BA honors in history in 1959. He was the winner of the Regents Medal for the highest standing in fifth-year honors arts at United College. Professor Martin also holds an honorary doctorate and LLD from the University of Winnipeg. After graduating in 1959 from the United College, Joe became an investment analyst at the Winnipeg-based Monarch Life. In 1961, he became the first and only executive assistant to the Honorable Duff Roblin, Premier of Manitoba. During his term as an EA, he was seconded to be the executive secretary of the Manitoba Royal Commission on Local Government, chaired by the future Governor General of Canada, Roland Michener, and then was appointed Chief Operating Officer of the Manitoba Centennial Corporation. In 1966, Joe left the government to join the Winnipeg office of the Canadian Management Consulting Practice of P.S. Ross and Partner, part of Touche Ross, chartered accountants, and in 1968 transferred to Toronto. In 1972, he became the partner in charge of the Toronto practice, and in 1978, he became the partner in charge of the Canadian practice. In 1990, with the international merger of Deloitte and Touche, Joe became chair of the International Management Consulting Committee. His professional work evolved from working with provincial, state, local government clients throughout Canada, all but BC, in the USA and South Africa, to becoming a leading consultant to Canada, teaching hospitals in Ontario and Alberta, and financial institutions in Toronto, St. Paul, Japan. Joe took early retirement in 1995 to serve on corporate boards, chairing Avista and Angus. Joe served his profession first as president of the Institute of Management Consultants of Ontario, and then as president of the Canadian Association of Management Consultants. In the realm of academia, Joe has authored several groundbreaking works. His books include Relentless Change, a casebook for the study of Canadian business history, published in 2010, and From Wall Street to Bay Street, a comparative history of the financial systems of the United States and Canada. It was made into a documentary and shown to 85% of PBS affiliates and was even translated into Mandarin and sold in China in 2023. In addition, Joe has written 5 chapters, 3 forwards, and 4 monographs since the role and place of Ontario in the Canadian Federation was first published in 1974 by the Ontario Economic Council. He has also supervised 11 business history case studies and written 3 more beyond the 13 published in Relentless Change. Professor Martin has written over 60 historical articles and book chapters, or business and management articles. His work has been published in Canada's History, the Financial Post, academic journals such as HR, BHR, ENS, Financial History, and HER. But he has also published in the Saskatchewan Folklore, the Polish Banker, and the Tiny Cottager. His subject matter has included the economy, industries, companies, and business and government matters. In recent years, he has reviewed books for McGill Queen's University Press and articles for the BHR published by the Harvard Business School. In addition to his time at the University of Toronto, Professor Martin also served as a visiting scholar at the University of Sydney, Australia in 2008, and his guest lectures included Harvard Canada Seminar at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs in 2005. Professor Martin is a prolific speaker. He has given nearly 200 presentations on historical and management topics. Many of these have been given in Toronto or his hometown of Winnipeg. He has also spoken across Canada and other parts of the world, in the USA, Europe, Asia Pacific, South Africa, and Bermuda. His awards and honors include the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal in 2012, Arbor Award from the University of Toronto for establishing the Canadian Business History Program, Philip B. Lind Award winner in 2008 for his assistance with the War of 1812 production, the Heritage Champion Award in 2013, and the Albany Club of Toronto Honoree of the Year for his work as club historian. Professor Martin has served with distinction with many societies, including as president of the Manitoba Historical Society from 1967 to 1968, Canada's National History Society. He served as the treasurer for the Ontario History Society, board member of the Canadian Canoe Museum, President Emeritus of Canada's National History Society, board member of the Chaplain Society, historian from 1995 to present. He's also served as the executive director of the Manitoba Centennial Corporation, created to coordinate Manitoba's efforts with those of Canada for the celebration of Canada's centennial in 1967 and to prepare for the celebration of Manitoba's entry into Confederation in 1970. Professor Martin, thank you so much for being with us today. You have done so many activities in relation to business. Can you tell me about your role as the founder of the Canadian Business History Association?
I think where it begins, tell them we need a business history course at the Rotman School of Management. This is the beginning, early years of this millennium. Remember that the Harvard Business School had a business history course in 1928. And the person who started it was a Canadian. And so I said, you think I should just go in and see the dean and tell him this? And the dean's last name was Martin, but we're not related. So I went in and we had a very good chat. And he, after no time at all, he says, that's a great idea, Joe. All you have to do is raise $3 million. And that may seem like quite a challenge, but it's the easiest $3 million I have ever raised. And I got it from 5 individuals. And they're well-known individuals. Red Wilson, who's been remarkably generous to history. He founded Historica. He's done great programs at McMaster. Dick Curry, Jim Fleck himself gave $250,000, and because he was on faculty, he was matched by the university. Hal Jackman, former Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, and Tony Fell, the legendary figure on Bay Street in Toronto. But was really nice, we also got another $50,000 US from the dean of the Harvard Business School, who happens to be a Canadian, just to show that he endorsed the program. And with the money, we set to work. And there was great difficulty finding a chair for the business history program. Great difficulty. I guess because it was new, business history is not taught, particularly in Canada. And the donors were getting quite agitated. So around 2009, 2010, I happened to be going to a business history conference in Milan. The Business History Conference is an American organization. They have an annual meeting. This year will be in Atlanta, but once every 5 years they go offshore. This particular year there was Milan, and one of my colleagues on faculty said, I know you've been having difficulty finding somebody to fulfill the role of the chair, but my friend Chris Kobrak is an American. Most of his degrees are from Columbia, but he's taught mostly in Europe, which is not typical. And he indeed spent most of his time teaching in Paris, although he also taught in Germany. He's going to be there, meet him and talk to him about it. Lo and behold, we did, and we recruited Chris Kobrak. So we finally had a chair. and he was a wonderful, wonderful guy. Unfortunately, he died far too early. But in some ways, he was like your typical American, boisterous. He was larger than life. But in other ways, he'd worked not only in Europe, but in Japan. Um, he could speak different languages. I'm not attesting to the quality of his accent in other languages, but he could certainly speak. And I've watched him in a French restaurant where they say it's important in French how you say it as well as what you say. And I thought his accent wasn't that good, but the Parisians loved him. And he came over, and he was really the inspiration for our program. And I remember one night sitting around with Chris, Dimitri Anastaskas, who until January 1st was chair of Canadian Business History Association, Andrew Ross, who was the current chair, Stephen Salmon from Archives Library in Canada, and others. But it was Chris who was the inspiration. And when we asked him to be chair, he said, I refuse. You must have a Canadian as chair. And we we didn't care that he's American, but he said, you must have. And that was it. Yeah. And that was the group that started it. That was 10 years ago. We're 9.5 years old. We'll soon be 10.
Mhm.
And that's how it all began.
Could you share with me, very good, thank you, Professor Martin. Could you share with me some of the programs and projects, the large programs and projects that the Business History Association has done, the Canadian Business History Association has done? I know they've had some conferences and so on.
Conferences obviously were a big thing, and quite out of the blue, the Leverhulme group, who'd never had from the UK, which you would probably know more about than I do, they approached us for the first conference in Canada, and that's who we had it with, and it was around corporate social responsibility. And we've subsequently we had a conference on 150 years of business in Canada in the centennial year, and we published this book,
Yes, yes.
Becoming 150. Later on, we had free trade, and we thought there wasn't going to be much more on that, but we now know with President Trump, there's going to be a lot more. And so those are the conferences. The most recent one was in Jasper in September of the past year. That was on the whole issue of global warming, etc. And then we had one in McGill a few years ago on the old city. Those are conferences. When COVID hit, we had a challenge. And so, as Arnold Toynbee, the great historian, said, for every challenge, there must be a response. So our challenge was COVID, and our response was what we call Canadian Business History Talks. And those are all on our website. And we've got a lot of them now, and we've got 2 more coming up in February, one with let's see, I've got the book right here. Excuse me. This is a fascinating little book. The author's name is Robert Stevens, and it hasn't been getting the attention it deserves because shortly after publication, Robert had some serious illness. But we're going to have him on, and it's about a person that Canadians have never heard of, a young man who took the train from Guelph, Ontario, to Chicago late in the 19th century and got a job in the commodity markets, made a fortune, made an absolute fortune. And then he felt, if you can believe it or not, that the Americans are getting too restrictive in their regulations. And he said, I'm leaving Chicago. The only free commodity market in North America is in Winnipeg, and I'm not going to go to Winnipeg. And he went to New York instead, where he made another fortune in the 20s, which he never lost, unlike a lot of people who made fortunes and lost them. And let me tell you, When I read the book, I immediately went to Wall Street, to Bay Street in Toronto. I talked to a legend of Bay Street. I'm not going to tell you his name. He'd never heard the story. Never heard the story. I talked to a golfer, and he said, "Oh, you mean the Cutton Golf Club?" So only golfers know him, but it is really fascinating how this person who's totally unknown, and it's a great story. And then after that, I'm going to be talking to Patrice Dutil from the Metropolitan University of Toronto on his new book out on John A. Macdonald and the year 1885, because so much of significance happened in that year. So that was one of the other things we've done.
Can you speak a little bit about your two main books that you've written?
Sure. They're very, very different. And so what happened was on the first one, because business history was so unusual at Rotman when we started, I said we won't have a textbook. Everything will be online to show that while we be talking about the past, we're with it. And but obviously we had to have lectures and all that developed. And so you have to give credit to the first two classes who basically said to me, who did not have a textbook, saying, you should produce a textbook. And they were the ones who contributed to it. So basically that book is divided into time periods, and within each time period, there is an overview, and then followed by 3 or 4 case studies. I think the first case study, in fact, I'm sure of it, was about the Bank Act of 1871, fundamental to the functioning of our country, a model for the world at the time. If you go on Google and said, which country has the best banking system in the world? You'll find Canada is rated number 1, but nobody in Canada knows it. In fact, there's more than one famous story about American professors coming to Canada and thinking, well, they'll like me because we're going to tell them what a great banking system they have. And they were practically booed off the stage because Canadians don't want to believe that. But by any real measure, it's a great banking system. It's the only one case study I've ever had where I did not write or supervise. And I had the legendary Bob McIntosh, who was the best CEO of the Canadian Banking Association in history, and he wrote it. So we had the case studies. I wrote or supervised the others, other than the one Bob wrote, and that book is a Canadian bestseller, which is kind of exciting. And it goes right to the present, deals with a wide variety of industries, and takes us from the Bank Act to the latter part of the 20th century. The other one, From Wall Street to Bay Street, was Chris Kobrak's idea, not mine. And Chris, what was interesting about it was he said, Joe, there's a world out there of developing countries. And we'll start this book when the United States and Canada were developing countries. I mean, everybody thinks today, the US in particular, but also Canada, developed countries. But what was it like when the countries were developing? And so we did that. I found it stimulating to work with Chris, and also I learned so much about history by the comparative method. What were they doing? What were we doing? And then let me tell you one disappointing story and 2 success stories. Sales are terrible. But we also did a documentary. It was shown on 85% of the PBS network. 85%. And I was told by the former CEO of WNED in Buffalo that they've never had that kind of response to anything. And then it was translated into Mandarin, and our sales in mainland China are 4 or 5 times as great as have been in North America, which I think
Amazing.
is incredible.
Hmm. Wonderful. I'm going to take you back a little to the beginning.
Right?
Um, you could you tell us your interest in history? You know, you studied history at United College. Could you tell me what, as a young person, what made you become interested in history?
Well, I've thought about that a lot, and I especially I've got a couple of my two youngest grandchildren are in their last year of high school, and they're going on to university, and been talking a bit with them. I did my high school in Manitoba. There was a uniform standard in those days. In other words, standardized exams, etc. And the high school I went to in grade 11 had a course on Canadian history. And the teacher, who always would talk about 3 things to do today, I'll never forget that, uh, had a record that nobody who took his course failed. So he taught so everybody passed. But in my view, he killed my interest. He really did. And if anybody had told me after a grade 11 course in Canadian history that I would ever have the slightest interest in history, especially Canadian history, I would have said, you're out of your mind. Well, the next year, grade 12, and my school in Winnipeg was Gordon Bell High School, and there was a legendary principal who was in his last year. And, you know, every other school in the city, the school board would tell them who was going to teach in his school, in the schools, but he fought that. He wanted his say, and he was a big supporter of veterans. We had female teachers too, but he liked veterans, and it didn't matter if some of them were a little bit shell shocked. When they went down the hall, they put out a signal that they were turning right or turning left. My teacher was a gentleman by the name of Bill Speechley. His mother was one of the first women to graduate from Cambridge University in the United Kingdom. She was active in Planned Parenthood early in the 20th century in Canada when there were legality issues around it. He himself, in addition to going to the University of Manitoba, had attended Harvard in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but also Cambridge University in England. And he'd been badly wounded during the war, and he was an extraordinary character. And he taught world history, and all of a sudden, I started to get an interest in history. So then I'm off to university, and my two best courses in high school were English and mathematics. So I sat down with my older sister, who was just completing college, and I said, what should I take? So she immediately said French and English. She was very good in French. She said philosophy. I didn't know about that, but you know, I took it and dropped uh, mathematics. I loved politics, so I took political science. And the final one was history. I got the highest mark in political science in the whole of the University of Manitoba, not just my college. And history was my second worst subject. But the professor of history was the best of the lot. And he inspired me. And you're too young to remember this, but just as I'm going to graduation, his name was Harry Crow. There was the famous Crow case at our college. It's one of the 3 worst academic disputes in the 20th century in Canada. And he was fired when a personal letter he wrote to a colleague didn't receive, the university did. So my final year, history, I took 3 of my 4 courses out at main campus, and the only one I took at United College was at my home long block south of the college, and we served wine at every meal. And so, and almost every history professor I ever had, and none of them taught business history, but they were just very good. And then I was planning on being a history professor, but that was the end of that. So I had to get a job.
Yeah.
And my father had been died when I was 13, so I didn't have a father to turn to. My mother couldn't really advise me. So I said, well, Winnipeg still is, I'm talking in 1959, a regional financial center with major insurance companies, the largest mutual fund company in Canada, strong banks and trust branches. And it was no problem in those years getting a job. And my first job was at Monarch Life, which has since been acquired by Manulife. And I was an investment analyst. I was really a clerk, not an analyst. I was a clerk. But what I learned was history was all around me because there was an organization, the Financial Post, which still exists, had decided in the late 1920s that they were concerned that the average investor was not getting objective advice, that they needed an honest historical base. So they produced yellow cards, which were circulated to every institutional investor in Canada. It's every year. And if something came up during the year, they'd send out a correction and a white card and a blue card for special occasions. We, today, Canadian Business History Association, is working to digitize those cards, which are an extraordinary historical resource, and we hope to have that done in the next year or two. So I went from studying history to saying, hey, people in business, they need this. They have to know the history if they're going to make a successful decision. Then I had the great fortune to have the Honorable Duff Robin, who was the Premier of Manitoba, asked me to come and work for him as an executive assistant. On my second day on the job, I had far more responsibility than in my 2 years at Monarch Life because Mr. Diefenbaker was Prime Minister. And much as I loved Mr. Diefenbaker, he had a hard time making decisions. And so he appointed royal commissions. I'll bet I've never seen an analysis of this, but I'd bet money that Mr. Diefenbaker appointed more royal commissions than any other prime minister in Canada. And the Royal Commission on Health Services, chaired by Justice Hall, was underway. And on my second day on the job, I was appointed coordinator of our submission to the Royal Commission on Health Services, which eventually led to Medicare. So this is not small potatoes. And I had to deal with the Minister of Health, who was a wonderful man, but administratively was a bit of a problem. And the Premier hired an outstanding lawyer to assist us on the brief. And he said, Joe, go and look at the passage of the Canadian Health Act in 1919 and see what we can learn from that.
Mm.
And by the way, that was pre-COVID, but that was the year they had that awful comparable problem in Canada. And you saw what they did, and we got and so the government of Canada before 1919 did not have a Department of Health. So those are the things I was quickly exposed
Pandemic, when they had the influenza pandemic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you can learn from history, and as when I went into consulting, I was nervous. My first day, we flew to Montreal from Winnipeg. Limousine took us up to the Laurentians. I said, boy, this is better than being an executive assistant to a premier. But I was nervous because I was a little bit older than most, and they were mostly MBAs, primarily from Ivy School at Western. And what was I? A history graduate who worked in the government. But the managing partner, who was so dynamic, and it was a young firm, but we were starting to get big jobs with companies like the Royal Bank, Sun Life. stood in front of us all and they said, any smartass MBA can tell you what's wrong with the company, but it takes someone with insight to tell you what was right with the company, that they survived 25, 50, 75, 100 years. Wow. That
And that's where
requires,
some of the history comes in as well.
right.
Mm-hmm.
So that I probably spoke too long on that topic, but you
No,
got
that's okay. No, that's very good. And then you have the experience of working with the corporate world. You then
yes.
moved into the corporate world and you went to the Canadian management consulting practice of PS Ross and Partner. And you went all the way to the top, dealing not only in Canada, but internationally. Can you tell me about your time in the corporate world
Sure.
and how you grew and how it eventually impacted your own academic work later on. So we'll start with your with from 1966 when you went into the
Well,
corporate world.
in the Winnipeg office, uh, I was quickly exposed to other things. There were two major grain handling companies in Winnipeg, Searle Grain and Federal Industries, and they merged, and we were asked to assist in the process. So I was given, you remember in Canada, there used to be grain elevators across the prairies every 8 miles. Well, all that grain went to Thunder Bay, where it was loaded into ships, which were brought down to Ontario and eventually shipped to Montreal and from there overseas to world markets. And I guess one of the nice things about Winnipeg, and this may not be totally relevant to history, but we had three young children, and I was supposed to catch a plane to Thunder Bay, and I slept in. And so brand new employee, what do I do? So I phoned a friend who I knew often flew to Thunder Bay, and I said, "Are you going to Thunder Bay this morning?" "Yes." "Can I fly with you?" He said, "You're here in half an hour." And so I went, and that's when I knew about line elevators because my father had been a line elevator agent, but you start to learn more about the channels of distribution. And that particular company eventually became Federal Industries. Jack Fraser in Winnipeg was a very dynamic CEO. They contracted me once where I brought my government knowledge to them because they said they felt they were being taxed too highly. And one of the things you find out, if you know anything about real property taxes, is that it's supposed to be objective, but there's a lot of judgment. And when you get something like an elevator terminal, and if you fly over Thunder Bay, you ever get there, this thing looks like it's out of the space age, and it was built back in the early 80s when we had our first energy crush. And the two provinces of Alberta and Ontario got together and they bring Alberta coal in. And as it arrived in 90 seconds, it would take in the middle of winter, unfreeze the coal, and it could go into a boat and ship down. And you say, what do I learn from that? Well, what are other unique buildings in the history of the world? And what are they now? So I have not thought specifically about your question, but it seemed to me there were all kinds of areas where I would look and learn about businesses. And the two most fascinating international countries for me were Japan and South Africa.
So a little bit more about your move with the merger with Deloitte and Touche.
Well, the merger occurred in 1990, and I will confess now that I wasn't keen on the merger. In fact, on the executive committee, there were two of us who were least enthused, but it proceeded. And internationally, they now have what are called the Big Four audit and accounting firms, of which Deloitte is the largest professional services firm in the world. But back in those days, while we were international, it was loosey-goosey. We had an outstanding affiliate in Japan, and briefly after the merger, the name was Deloitte Touche Tohmatsu.
Yes.
But if you went to the United Kingdom, the Deloitte partners made a decision not to come into the merger, which I've never been able to figure out. And in Australia, the Touche partners didn't come into the merger. But in Canada, we came in, the United States, we came in, and this great international organization was built. And at that time, the main business of those firms was audit and accounting. The second business was tax. The third business was consulting. So we always felt we were sort of had to push to be recognized as citizens. But again, what I did historically, and this is just before the merger, I was president. I did two things professionally. When I was president of the Institute of Management Consultants, I read a book about the history of professions in England in the 19th century. And I learned how many years it took to get legislation through the British House of Commons to where they had certification and licensure. I thought, well, surely the consultants can learn from that. And my outgoing speech as past president, I said, this should be our dream. And quite frankly, we immediately got the certification, but I think my successors pressed too hard, not they were too smart, and we didn't get the certification, and I don't know what they're doing now. When I was at the association, I said, here's an historic opportunity when Mr. Mulrooney announced he was going to run on a platform of free trade. And it was terrible being a consultant trying to work in the United States of America because they had non-tariff barriers. Now, that wasn't a problem. If I was going to Miami in the middle of winter because I could put on my tennis whites and go out to the airport with my tennis bag and say, what are you doing? Well, I'm going to play tennis. Not tell them I was going to meet with the mayor of Miami. Didn't work as well in January and going to New York. And so we were very fortunate that when the Mulrooney government was in power, there was a cabinet minister from Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, Jim Kelleher, and he worked as a lawyer in both Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario and Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, so he knew the problems. And we were able to have that breakthrough. And I don't know whether people are paying enough attention to that issue today. But just one last story in the US and why I was keen for us to work in the US, because I was a brand new partner in 1972, and a call came from the Atlanta office to come down and talk to an assignment that they had with the governor. I'd never been to the South before, totally new experience. And, I think consultants like new experiences. Stayed at Jamie Portman's Hyatt Regency, went to underground Atlanta, which was a new tourist thing at the time. And I said over lunch, I'd done the research. I said, here are my views of what we should be dealing with. And I said, where are we going for dinner? Consultants like to know where they're eating, sleeping. They said, we're going to the governor's mansion. I said, to the governor's mansion? Wow, do you mean to say tonight I got to be at the governor's mansion sipping mint juleps? No alcohol on state premises. So I said, what's the name of your governor? They said, a chap by the name of Jimmy Carter. Is he any good? We think so. So go to the governor's mansion, and there is Jimmy Carter, his wife, and his 5-year-old daughter. The daughter doesn't stay for dinner, but I'm at the head table with Jimmy Carter, and I wrote about it in Saturday's Globe.
Yes,
Those
our
are the kind of
article.
exciting experiences you get in that business.
Mhm. Interesting. What I found really, really good was how even when you're in business, you still interweave your history and you use your knowledge and history to sometimes look at how things have changed and try and predict what can be done in that particular corporate world. So a lot
Right.
of times that is especially interesting how you have use your knowledge and history over the years.
That's what I teach the students.
Mhm.
In the course on business history, I say, look at, don't you think it'd be useful?
Coming back to the present day, what do you think are the some of the areas for business history and some of the areas for business history in Canada that should be explored?
Well, I think there are all kinds of opportunities, and I really like the idea of what you do of publishing books. And one of when I first started, the Canadian Business History Association hasn't been all success. I assumed, based on my experience with talking to people in other countries, particularly Sweden, which has an incredible Swedish business history center. And as you know, the Nordic countries are very successful internationally, in spite of their small size. So um, I wanted I wanted us to, and what I learned from my visit to Sweden, what Chris taught me from what he saw in Germany and France, was the chambers of commerce were
Mhm.
good partners.
Yes.
So I spent a lot of time in the early years of the Canadian Business History Association wooing or trying to woo the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. It was to no avail. And I just thought, look at the opportunities. They have an annual meeting and they've got all those companies. Surely they would have a spot in the agenda to have a session on writing your corporate history. Because as you know, if you're a 45-year-old corporation and you want to celebrate your 50th anniversary, if you haven't established the archive, you're going to have a tough time.
Yes. Hmm.
And I thought it was a surefire bestseller, but in spite of the fact that Perrin Beatty was an acquaintance of mine, I got nowhere. Later on, we were approached by the Metropolitan Board of Trade, and I thought, well, maybe I made a mistake going to the national body. Maybe this is where we should go, but that went nowhere. Then, when they changed leadership at the Ontario Chamber, I tried once again. I just couldn't build the interest. But I mean, we've got some great Canadian business, and their stories have never been told. So there's the writing of Canadian business history. There is taking the history we have and injecting business into it. One of the things I did, wearing my dual hat of both a teacher at Rotman and as president of the Business History Association, was go to associations outside of North America for their annual meeting. And I remember once, I think it was the meeting was at the University of Sheffield, and I was having dinner with a professor from a very small British university, and he was fully engaged. Like the university was a tiny compared to the University of Toronto, but he had a full program. And so that was in Sheffield, and then I was startled. Here's a new book which I think you'd be interested in. I've just gotten it. Illustrated Business History of the United States.
Yes.
Even in the United States, the author claims they don't integrate business. And I think, if anything, I think of them as a model.
Hmm.
But, and my particular beef is around the Bank Act. On the 150th anniversary of the best bank act in the world, I could not get anything published in Canada. I did get it published on Wall Street. But I mean, there's something wrong when we don't know our own business stories.
Business history. Yes. Very, very true. Very
So, and I'm sorry I get a little bit emotional about the subject.
Well, that's what my company does. My company writes histories for organizations, companies, and so on.
I saw
So
that. I think that's terrific. And
thank
by
you
the
so
way,
much.
why can't there be even a little bit more on business in the public schools? When uh, do you know the magazine Canada's History? It used to be called The Beaver.
Yes.
Well, the newest edition, uh, I'm a president emeritus of the organization that publishes it. It used to be published by the Hudson Bay Company. I've been reading it for over 70 years. The newest edition has an article on the village I grew up in the 1940s in Saskatchewan about the cheese factory.
Interesting.
And when I was in grade 7, I think our teacher he was a guy, 20 years of age. I'm sure he had not been to normal school, but he's one of the best teachers I ever had. And we chartered a bank, and I have my share certificate. 10, I had 10 shares for $1. And at the end of the year, we paid a 10% dividend because we'd made good loans. I mean,
Interesting.
you got to learn things like that. And so, and I guess one of the things I get excited about business in general, not just business history, is consultants travel. You're on airplanes all the
Yeah.
time, and you sit beside people you've never met. So you talk to them, ask them what they do. And if you get them talking about their business, there's so much variety in business,
Mhm.
so many things you wouldn't think of. We had one client who made vitrified clay sewer pipe,
Mhm.
just like the Romans 2,000 years ago. And then, great business, and then PVC pipe came along, changed the dynamics.
Completely.
Okay? And then we recommend they get into garbage disposal because they had land that would absorb all the nasty things in garbage. So, but then you run into individuals, and I asked the client how things were proceeding because I thought, and it wasn't my idea, it was the guy, a young man working with me. And they said, well, we're having problems. I said, what kind of problems? Dad is afraid to mention your solution to his father. And I didn't even know the grandfather was still alive, but those are every time I'm on the highway and I see those vitrified clay pipes, I think back to ancient Rome. I think of all that air being moved and how if you get a PVC plant close to a sewer, a pipe plant, you're going to be out of business if you're a pipe plant.
Miss Martin, it has been wonderful chatting with you here today.
Wonderful
Your
chatting with you.
it has your experience is so vast, and I want to thank you for sharing your knowledge with us today. I know that we could have another meeting and we could go on and speaking for days, and we have only the tip of the iceberg in relation to your knowledge of Canadian history and all that you have done in the corporate world. And I want to thank you so much for all that you have shared with me today. And I'm sure my audience will be interested in hearing about your history, your corporate history, and also your leadership in starting the Canadian Business History Association and
Don't forget
all
Chris
the,
Kobrak.
pardon me?
Don't forget Chris Kobrak.
Yes, and Chris
We talk
Kovac
about leadership.
in
He's
ensuring that we
he's
have.
number one. I may be 2 or 3. Okay.
Okay. Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Professor Martin. It was an honor to meet you.
My pleasure to meet you. I assure you.
Okay, thank you. Have a good day.
Same to you.